Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about William Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 1, which is widely regarded to be one of Shakespeare's worst plays. And it is. Just kidding. You know I wouldn't leave you like that. We are going to talk about Henry VI, Part 1. It's an interesting play. I actually don't think it's terrible. It's not necessarily the sort of fantastic quality of Shakespeare's best work from his mature career, but it's actually, I think, decent. It's a history play. And apparently it was one of the first history plays, or the Henry VI series, there's 3 plays altogether, were apparently some of the first plays to stage battles. Typically, before that, the way that Greek tragedy had done things was what English Renaissance dramatists did, where a battle would be reported on. Henry VI actually stages a number of battles. And so that's actually interesting because literary critics have regarded that as a flaw of the play, as sort of cheap melodrama or something like this, in the way that like action movies have a lot of gunfights and car chases and things like this. But one of the things that's quite important about it is, if we think about the actual reason Shakespeare is writing, he's not writing for literature scholars. He's not writing for people like me. He's writing for the theater, and he's writing for an audience mostly composed of working class people, maybe peasants. A lot of apprentices are going to the theater in the early modern period. And so these people want some spice, they want some zest in their plays. And so when we get the battles between the English and the French in Henry VI, that's one of the things that Shakespeare is doing to sort of acknowledge that. So Henry VI Part 1 takes place during the 100 Years' War. It takes place at the very beginning of the Wars of the Roses. And so this is after the death of Henry V, who is one of the top medieval English kings. Really a high point for England in terms of conquering stuff on the continent. They owned a large portion of France. And we begin at Henry V's death. We begin at his funeral. And things start going south for the English. So I'm going to read you actually a decent portion of this opening part of Act 1, Scene 1, because it introduces us to a lot of the ideas and concerns that we see in the English camp. So we've got a bunch of people, a bunch of nobles at Henry V's funeral. So we've got the Duke of Bedford, Duke of Gloucester, Duke of Exeter, Earl of Warwick, and Bishop of Winchester, and Duke of Somerset. So Bedford starts out, "Hung be the heavens with black, yield day to night. Comets importing change of times and states brandish your crystal tresses in the sky, and with them scourge the bad revolting stars that have consented unto Henry's death. King Henry V, too famous to live long, England ne'er lost a king of so much worth." And Gloucester takes up this theme. "England never had a king until his time. Virtue he had, deserving to command. His brandished sword did blind men with his beams, his arms spread wider than a dragon's wings, his sparkling eyes, replete with wrathful fire, more dazzled and drove back his enemies than midday sun, fierce bent against their faces. What should I say? His deeds exceed all speech, he ne'er lifted up his hands but conquered." Exeter says, "We mourn in black, why mourn we not in blood? Henry is dead and never shall revive. Upon a wooden coffin we attend in death's dishonorable victory. We with our stately presence glorify, like captives bound to a triumphant car. What should we pursue what shall we curse the planets of mishap that plotted thus our glory's overthrow? Or shall we think the subtle-witted French conjurers and sorcerers that, afraid of him by magic verses, have contrived his end? Winchester says, he was a king blessed of the King of Kings. Unto the French the dreadful judgment day so dreadful will not be as was his sight. The battles of the Lord of Hosts he fought, the church's prayers made him so prosperous. And Gloucester, in response to Winchester, says, the church, where is it? Had not churchmen prayed, his thread of life had not so soon decayed. None do you like but an effeminate prince, whom like a schoolboy you may overawe. Remember, Winchester is a bishop. And Winchester replies, Gloucester, whatever we like, thou art protector, and look'st to command the prince and realm. Thy wife is proud, she holdeth thee in awe, more than God or religious churchman may. And Gloucester says, name not religion, for thou lovest the flesh, and ne'er throughout the church, the year to church thou goest, except it be to pray against thy foes. So we've got a lot of good stuff right here at the beginning. I like it. It's a little didactic. It's not fantastic. It's not, super interesting or exciting, but it's actually, there's stuff going on here that's neat. So starting with Bedford, and then it comes up again in Exeter's speech here. We have references to the heavens, to comets, to planets. And this is one of the big things in the medieval period and the early modern period, was people very much believed in astrology. They believed that the alignment of the heavens created good or ill fortune. They looked for omens. Comets were regarded as terrible luck, etc., etc. So we've got those things. And that's interesting in itself. We've got this bit at the end of Exeter's speech. Or shall we think the subtle-witted French conjurers and sorcerers that, afraid of him, by magic verses have contrived his end? Now this is an interesting reference, because this actually sets us up for a big theme throughout the play, because one of the characters in Henry VI Part 1 is Joan of Arc, who's presented here as Joan la Poussille. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't speak French. But Joan of Arc is in this play, and she's, as we all know, she's now today a saint, but she, in the play, presents herself to Charles, the French Dauphin, as a prophetess, holy virgin, touched by God, chosen to lead the armies of France against the English, etc., etc. The English think that she's a witch, and so that comes up throughout the play, and I'll come back to that later on, because it's an interesting idea. But right from the beginning, from the third speech in this play, we have that introduction of the idea that the French are somehow using witchcraft, somehow using black magic, where arms, where their military prowess would otherwise fail them. And then we get to this bit with Winchester and Gloucester, where we have a division. So remember, this is at Henry V's funeral. The king is lying there dead, and Winchester and Gloucester are having a go at one another. So this is one of the other big themes, is we have divisions in this play. Divisions amongst the English. Winchester and Gloucester are opposed to one another, and then the other big opposition that gets set up is between what's his rank? It's Somerset, Duke of Somerset, and Richard Plantagenet, who at the beginning of the play is just a yeoman because he was stripped of his title after his father was executed for treason. But then Richard gets re-ennobled in this play by Henry VI, and he becomes Duke of York again. So those two, Somerset and York, or Somerset and Richard Plantagenet, depending on which portion of the play you're talking about, they are in opposition to one another. And at some point, Act 2, Scene 4, Richard chooses a white rose to be his symbol, and Somerset chooses a red rose to be his symbol. And so this, we get the origin of the War of the Roses, which was an extended conflict, a dynastic conflict in medieval England, between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. And actually, we have a sort of extended speech here from Mortimer, who's Richard's uncle. Yeah, Mortimer is Richard's uncle. He explains to Richard sort of the background of what would become the War of the Roses. So again, this is a history play, and we're learning history to a certain extent. We're also learning bad history because Shakespeare apparently had no idea when Joan of Arc actually died, but that's okay. So that's the thing that we're getting. The other big theme that's introduced right from the beginning is this sort of loss of chivalry, that Henry V was this magnificent king. And we actually see that later on in Shakespeare's career with his Henry V. He is this sort of great military leader, and this just, virtuous king. And so a lot of this opening scene here is about that loss of virtue, that loss of valor. And actually, in just a little bit, a messenger comes in, and he's basically like, hey, we lost a bunch of territory in France while you guys have been over here having this funeral and whatnot. And he actually says, because Exeter says, how were they lost? What treachery was used? The messenger says, no treachery, but want of men and money. Amongst the soldiers this is muttered, that here you maintain several factions, and whilst a field should be dispatched and fought, you are disputing of your generals. One would have lingering wars with little cost, another would fly swift, but wanteth wings, a third thinks without expense at all by guileful fair words peace may be obtained. Awake, awake, English nobility! Let not sloth dim your honours new begot. Cropped are the flower deluces in your arms. Of England's coat one half is cut away. So again, we've got this theme of the dangers of division, the dangers of sort of not taking the military threat of France seriously. And we get this later on in the play. Yep. Because Sir William Lucy. So this is much later on. This is Act 4, Scene 3. Sir William Lucy first comes to... because in order to try and heal the division between Somerset and York, Henry VI has put Somerset in charge of the cavalry and York in charge of the infantry in France, with the intention that they would work together for the best interests of England. There's one English general in the play who's just amazing, like, great warrior, chivalric leader, the sort of ideal character that we had with Henry V. His name is Talbot. And he needs reinforcements. He's badly outnumbered by the French. He sends word to York and Somerset to reinforce him. Each of them thinks that the other is going to do it, or wants the other to send reinforcements, and so neither of them does. And so Lucy first comes to York, to Richard Plantagenet, and basically says, why aren't you taking your troops there? And York's like, well, I wanted Somerset to do it, but he's refusing, so I can't go. And then Lucy goes to Somerset, and he's like, why aren't you taking your troops there? And Somerset's like, well, Talbot and York wanted to do this thing. I didn't want to do it, so I'm not. I can't send my guys there. And now that I've been convinced, it's too late. And Lucy has this pretty blistering indictment of them for letting their personal divisions come before the interests of England. He says, "Whither, my lord, from bought," because Somerset asks, "Whither were you sent?" He says, "Whither, my lord, from bought and sold Lord Talbot, who ringed about with bold adversity, cries out for noble York and Somerset to beat assailing death with his weak legions. And while the honourable captain here drops bloody sweat from his war-wearied limbs, and unadvantaged lingering looks for rescue, you, his false hopes, the trust of England's honour, keep off aloof with worthless emulation. Let not your private discord keep away the levied succours that would lend him aid, while he, renowned noble gentleman, yield up his life unto a world of odds. Orleans the bastard, Charles in Burgundy, Alençon, René compass him about, and Talbot perishes by your default." And then a little bit later he says, "The fraud of England, not the force of France, hath now entrapped the noble-minded Talbot. Never to England shall he bear his life, but dies betrayed to fortune by your strife." So this is one of the big ideas of the play, is that the English are divided amongst themselves, and this is why France is winning. This is why France is succeeding, because the English are not able to pull together and overcome their individual egoistic differences. The other thing that's interesting in the play is that we have a lot of scenes of the French. And early on, they're actually pretty solid. For being such a patriotic, rah-rah England play, the French initially are presented pretty honorably. Like the first time that Joan of Arc is brought into Charles, the Dauphin of France, we have this interesting speech where she says, "Dauphin, I am by birth a shepherd's daughter, my wit untrained in any kind of art. Heaven and Our Lady gracious hath it pleased to shine on my contemptible estate. Lo, whilst I waited on my tender lambs, and to sun's parching heat displayed my cheeks, God's mother deigned to appear to me, and in a vision full of majesty willed me to leave my base vocation and free my country from calamity. Aid she promised, and assured success. In complete glory she revealed herself, and whereas I was black and swart before, with those clear rays with which she infused on me, that beauty am I blessed with, which you may see. Ask me what question thou canst possible, and I will answer unpremeditated. My courage try by combat if thou darest, and thou shalt find that I exceed my sex. Resolve on this, thou shalt be fortunate, if thou receive me for thy warlike mate." And Charles says, "Thou hast astonished me with thy high terms. Only this proof I'll of thy valour make. In single combat thou shalt buckle with me, and if thou vanquishest, thy words are true, otherwise I renounce all confidence." So we've got here a number of interesting things. Joan is clearly setting herself up as someone who has been visited by God and sent on a divine mission. But we've also got this element of rhetoric here. Like Charles says, "Thou hast astonished me with thy high terms." So this idea of rhetoric, of persuasion, is something that keeps coming up in the play. And of course that makes a lot of sense in an early modern drama where the majority of the play is driven by speech. And so early modern audiences were much more attuned to listening than modern audiences are. They were much more attuned to being able to process information orally, whereas today we tend to be more visual, largely because of things like TV and movies. We've also got this other chivalric element here. So the sort of lifted up by God element is related to chivalry. But when Charles challenges her to single combat, this idea of trial by combat to prove one's troth, to prove that one is honest, this is straight out classical chivalry. So Joan is in this chivalric tradition, at least initially. Her rhetoric is important in other places as well, because at one point the French decide that they're going to try and persuade Burgundy, who's fighting on behalf of the English, to join the French. And Joan says, "Then thus must it be. This doth Joan devise. By fair persuasions mixed with sugared words we will entice the Duke of Burgundy to leave the Talbot and to follow us." And so they call Burgundy to a conference, basically, and Joan gives him these speeches, and he says, he has a couple of asides here. First he says, "Either she hath bewitched me with her words, or nature makes me suddenly relent." And then later, after another of Joan's speeches, he says, "I am vanquished. These haughty words of hers have battered me like roaring cannon shot, and made me almost yield upon my knees." And then to the others he says, "Forgive me, country and sweet countrymen, and lords, accept this hearty, kind embrace. My forces and my power of men are yours. So farewell, Talbot, I'll no longer trust thee." So Joan convinces someone who's fighting on behalf of the English to join the French via rhetoric. Good stuff. The last thing I want to talk about, just very, very briefly, is near the very end, Joan's character seems to change. Scene 5-3 is basically her on stage calling up some demons to help her defeat the English. So we have here a very distinct turnaround from the "I'm a holy warrior called by God" idea, but this is where it gets very English, because the English did regard Joan of Arc as a witch. They did believe she was in league with the devil, or they claimed they believed it. And so this is the sort of, yeah, you thought those Frenchies were okay before, but actually, look, they're consorting with devils. So you get that kind of element here.